The rope was tied tight. So tight the girl's wrists were rubbed raw, bleeding into the fibers. She was pinned to a wooden post in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. September, 1874. The kind of day where the sun doesn't just warm you, it cooks you. And the desert air didn't carry the smell of sagebrush. It smelled like gunpowder. It smelled like fear. A lone rancher stood a few feet away, a knife clutched in his fist. His name was Silas, and every bone in his body screamed that this was wrong. Not the rope, not the girl. The silence. The way the canyon walls seemed to be watching him. This wasn't a rescue. It was a test. He stepped forward, the dust barely stirring under his boots. Her eyes met his, and there weren't any tears, just a quiet, hollow terror that made his own blood run cold. He raised the knife, ready to slice through the rope that held her. But then she whispered it. 4 words that changed everything. "I'm just bait," she whispered. The words hit Silas harder than a fist. He froze, the blade hovering over the rope. Bait. His eyes scanned the high ridges that circled them like stone giants. He couldn't see anyone, but he could feel them. Dozens of eyes, he figured, all trained on him. He should have turned around. He should have mounted his horse and ridden until the sun was at his back. But he looked at her face, streaked with dust and fear, and he couldn't. He was a man who'd spent 10 years trying to outrun the ghosts of his past, trying to forget the feel of a gun in his hand. Leaving her here would just add another ghost to the crowd. So he cut the rope. It fell away in 2 pieces, slumping to the dirt like dead snakes. The girl didn't move. She just trembled, as if the weight of freedom was too much to bear. And that's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the desert. The soft, metallic click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. It was close. Too close. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, and suddenly, Silas felt like he was standing in a cage. The girl lowered her head, her hair falling across her face. Her voice was barely a breath, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "They want you," she said. "Not me." Silas's hand, the one not holding the knife, instinctively went to the empty holster at his hip. He hadn't worn a gun in years. He'd made a promise. Now he'd never felt so naked, so helpless. The knife in his hand felt like a child's toy. He wanted to ask who they were. He wanted to ask why. But his throat was as dry as the dirt beneath his feet. The girl finally looked up at him, and her eyes held a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. As if she'd seen this exact scene play out a dozen times before, with a dozen different men. And none of them had walked away. "You should have left me," she whispered. And in that moment, Silas knew 2 things for certain. She was telling the truth. And it was already too late. The desert that had been his home, his sanctuary from a violent past, had just become his tomb. He was trapped, standing over a girl who was nothing more than a lure, with unseen rifles aimed directly at his heart. He'd walked into the snare with his eyes wide open. But the hunters weren't done playing with him yet. That single rifle click wasn't a warning shot. It was the start of the show. Another click echoed from a different ridge, then another, and another. It sounded like a symphony of death, a circle of steel and wood closing in around him. They were everywhere. Silas grabbed the girl's arm. It was bony and frail. "Who are they?" he gritted out, his voice a low growl. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. "Men who don't forget," she breathed. "You're Silas. Silas Kane." Hearing his full name spoken in this place sent a jolt through him. He'd just been the rancher for a decade. He'd buried Silas Kane along with his guns and his reputation. But someone had dug him up. Before he could demand more answers, the ground began to tremble. A low rumble that grew into the thunder of hoofbeats. From the mouth of the canyon, riders appeared. Dark silhouettes against the bleeding sunset, rifles held high. They weren't just watching from the ridges. They were coming for him. Silas instinctively shoved the girl behind him, turning his body into a shield. It was a fool's gesture, a knife against a dozen rifles. But it was all he had left. The riders fanned out, forming a perfect half circle, cutting off any chance of escape. They moved with a chilling precision, like wolves herding their prey for the final kill. The man in the lead, a bull of a man with a face like scarred leather, reined in his horse just 20 yards away. He didn't raise his rifle. He just smiled. It was a cold, cruel thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas Kane!" the man boomed, his voice echoing in the dead air. "We've been waiting a long time for this." Silas's mind raced. He didn't recognize the man. He didn't recognize any of them. But they knew him. They knew the name he hadn't used since he'd left the life of a gunslinger behind. "You have me mistaken," Silas said, his voice steady, despite the hammer pounding in his chest. The lead rider laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "No mistake. A man leaves a trail of bodies. He doesn't get to just disappear. You think a fence and a few head of cattle can wash away the blood?" He spat on the ground. "Redding sends his regards." Redding. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Augustus Redding. A cattle baron from the north whose power was matched only by his cruelty. A man Silas had crossed 10 years ago. A man whose son, Billy, had drawn on Silas in a dusty saloon. Billy was fast. Silas was faster. He never thought Redding would wait a decade for his revenge. The lead rider gestured with his rifle toward the girl cowering behind Silas. "The girl was a nice touch, eh? We knew you couldn't resist playing the hero. It's your weakness, Kane. Always has been." Silas tightened his grip on the knife. He was outmanned, outgunned, and standing in a perfectly designed kill box. His past had finally caught up to him, and it wore a crooked smile and held a dozen rifles. But then the girl did something unexpected. She stepped out from behind him. Her trembling had stopped. Her face, though still pale, was set with a strange resolve. She looked not at Silas, but at the lead rider. "You promised, Kane," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You promised you wouldn't kill him here. You said you'd just bring him in." The rider, Kane, lost his smile. His face hardened. "Plans change, Alara. Your father wants this done clean, and this is as clean as it gets. Alara." The girl had a name, and she knew these men. She wasn't just bait, she was part of it. The realization twisted in Silas's gut like a knife. He hadn't just been a fool. He'd been betrayed by the very person he was trying to save. "He dies," Kane said, finally raising his rifle. "And you get to watch." The world seemed to slow down. The setting sun cast long, dark shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The circle of riders tightened, their horses shifting nervously. The barrels of their rifles gleamed, all pointed at his chest. Silas glanced at Alara. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time, he saw tears welling up. But they weren't for him. They were for herself. She had made a deal with devils, and now they were changing the terms. He was a dead man. He knew it. But Silas Kane hadn't survived a dozen gunfights by accepting fate. If he was going to die, he wasn't going to die easy. He angled his body slightly, shifting his weight to the balls of his feet. The knife felt heavier, more solid in his hand. It wasn't a gun, but it would have to do. Kane saw the shift. His lip curled into a sneer. "Don't even think about it, old man. Your time is over." But Silas wasn't looking at Kane anymore. He was looking past him, at the rock formations on the canyon rim. He was calculating angles, distances, possibilities. His mind, the part he'd tried to keep dormant for 10 years, was waking up. The gunslinger was coming back, and then he saw it, a glint of light, high on the ridge to his left. It wasn't from a rifle barrel. It was different. A reflection off something else. Something he recognized. A spyglass. Someone else was watching. Someone who wasn't part of Kane's crew. This trap was more complicated than he thought. There were more players in the game, and that tiny, impossible detail was the only thing that gave him a sliver of hope. It meant the story wasn't over yet. He met Kane's eyes, letting a slow, cold smile spread across his own face. "You first," Silas whispered, and he threw the knife. It wasn't aimed at Kane. That would be suicide. It was aimed at the dirt, right in front of Kane's horse. The blade spun end over end, kicking up a cloud of red dust as it slammed into the ground. It was a distraction, a 1-second gamble. But 1 second was all he needed. The horse reared, startled by the sudden movement. Kane cursed, fighting to control his mount. And in that single moment of chaos, Silas moved. He lunged, not away from the riders, but toward them. He grabbed Alara, pulling her down with him as he dove behind the very post she'd been tied to. It wasn't much cover, just a thick piece of wood. But it was better than nothing. A volley of rifle fire erupted, splintering the air where they had been standing just a second before. Wood chips flew from the post as bullets tore into it. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very ground. Silas pressed himself and the girl against the dirt, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nostrils. He could hear the riders shouting, their horses stamping impatiently. He had bought himself a few seconds, but he was still pinned down. "What are you doing?" Alara cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "Surviving," he grunted, his eyes scanning the chaos. Kane was still fighting his spooked horse. The other riders were hesitant, unsure if they should charge or keep firing. He had disrupted their perfect formation, but it wouldn't last. He knew he had only one chance, not to escape, not yet, but to change the board, to turn their strength against them. Kane finally wrestled his horse under control, his face a mask of pure fury. "He's behind the post! Spread out! Flank him!" The riders started to move, widening their circle to get a clear shot. Silas knew he had maybe 5 seconds before they had him in a crossfire. He looked at the girl beside him. Her face was a mess of terror and confusion. "When I move, you run," he ordered. "Run for the rocks on the east wall. Don't stop." "They'll shoot me," she sobbed. "No, they won't," Silas said, his voice grim. "You're Redding's daughter. You're more valuable to them alive." It was a guess, a wild one, but it was the only card he had to play. He'd seen the look on Kane's face when she'd spoken. She was important. He didn't wait for her reply. He took a deep breath, gathered his legs under him, and exploded from behind the post. He ran in a zigzag, not toward the rocks, but straight at the line of riders on the right flank. It was the last thing they expected. They were anticipating a cornered man trying to find cover, not a madman charging a line of rifles. The gamble paid off. They hesitated for a crucial second, their aim thrown off by his sudden, insane charge. A rifle fired, the bullet whizzing past his ear. Another kicked up dust by his boot. He saw Alara out of the corner of his eye. She was running, just as he'd told her, scrambling toward the jagged rocks that offered the only real cover in the canyon. Kane screamed her name, his voice laced with panic. It worked. He had divided their attention. Half the men were focused on him. The other half were now watching their prize, Redding's daughter trying to escape. Silas wasn't trying to reach the riders. He was trying to reach their horses. He was just 10 feet from the nearest one when a bullet tore through the flesh of his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, pain exploding through him like a bolt of lightning. He stumbled, his vision swimming, but he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth and launched himself forward. He crashed into the side of a horse, grabbing onto the saddle horn with his good arm. The rider, caught by surprise, tried to bring his rifle around to bear, but Silas was too close. Silas slammed his shoulder into the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he yanked the rider from the saddle. The man tumbled to the ground with a grunt. Silas swung himself up, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. He grabbed the reins, kicking the horse's flanks hard. The animal bolted, charging straight through the disorganized line of men. He was out. He was free. But he didn't ride for the canyon mouth. He didn't ride for safety. He wheeled the horse around, a wild look in his eyes. He saw Alara halfway to the rocks. He saw Kane, his face purple with rage, aiming his rifle not at Silas, but at her. "Stop, or the girl dies!" Kane bellowed. Silas didn't stop, because he knew something Kane didn't. He knew Kane was bluffing. They needed her alive. But more than that, he knew this wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about turning the tables. He charged. He rode straight for the man who had been watching from the ridge. Not Kane's man. The one with the spyglass. As he galloped toward the canyon wall, he pulled the rifle from the saddle scabbard. It felt familiar in his hand. Too familiar. It felt like coming home. He glanced back one last time. Kane was lowering his rifle, his face a picture of disbelief. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. They expected the rancher. They got Silas Kane. The horse scrambled up the rocky incline, its hooves finding purchase where it seemed impossible. Silas clung to its back, the rifle held tight, the world a blur of dust and adrenaline. He was no longer the prey. He was the hunter now, and he was going to find out who else had a stake in his death. The ascent was brutal. Rocks scraped against his legs, and every jolt sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder. But he didn't slow down. He could hear shouting below, the chaos of Kane's men trying to regroup. They wouldn't stay confused for long. He reached the ridge where he'd seen the glint of light and threw himself from the saddle, rolling behind a cluster of boulders. The horse, spooked and riderless, galloped on along the cliff top. Good. Let them follow it. Silas pressed himself against the rock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood was seeping through his shirt, warm and sticky. He ignored it. He peeked over the boulder. Down below, the scene was chaos. Kane had half his men chasing after the horse, while the other half were trying to corner Alara, who had made it to the rocks. She was trapped, but she was alive. For now. He turned his attention to his immediate surroundings. The spot was empty. Whoever was here was gone. But they'd left something behind. Footprints, and a single spent shell casing. It was from a Sharp's rifle, a long-range weapon, a sniper's weapon. And next to it, half hidden under a bush, was a leather satchel. Silas crawled over, the rifle cradled in his good arm. He flipped open the satchel. Inside, there wasn't a spyglass. There were papers, maps, and a letter. He pulled out the letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a set of instructions. His blood ran cold as he read it. Kane is predictable. He will trap Kane in the canyon floor. Your task is not to interfere, but to observe. Confirm that Kane is the man we believe him to be. If he fights, if he shows the skills of his past, you are to eliminate Kane and his men. Do not let them take Kane alive. He is more valuable to us than to Redding. The girl is a liability. If she cannot be controlled, eliminate her as well. The asset must be protected. Silas read it again, the words blurring together. The asset. He was the asset. This wasn't just Redding's revenge plot. This was something else entirely. Someone had set up this entire encounter, not just to trap him, but to test him. To see if the gunslinger was still alive inside the rancher. And Redding's men, the hunters, were also the hunted. A new player was on the board. Someone with more power and a darker purpose than a vengeful cattle baron. Someone who had been watching him for who knows how long. Someone who wanted him alive. But for what? He looked down at the canyon again. Kane was barking orders, his frustration clear even from this distance. Alara was backed into a small cave-like opening in the rock wall, cornered. They were all puppets. Him, Alara, even Kane. And a hidden puppet master was pulling the strings. Suddenly the pieces clicked into place. The planted knife. The elaborate trap. The spyglass that was never a spyglass. It was a rifle scope. The watcher wasn't just observing, he was waiting. Silas had passed the test. He had fought back, which meant the watcher's orders were now to eliminate Kane. He scanned the opposite ridge, his eyes tracing the line of rock and shadow. And then he saw him. A lone figure, almost invisible against the terrain, raising a Sharps rifle. The long barrel was not pointed at Silas. It was pointed directly at Kane. Silas had a choice. He could let it happen. Let this unknown sniper take out Kane and his men. It would solve his immediate problem. He could slip away in the confusion, disappear back into the desert. Or he could intervene. He could save the man who had come to kill him, because Kane, for all his cruelty, was a devil he knew. This new player, this hidden sniper, was something far more dangerous. He looked from the sniper to Kane, then down to Alara, who was watching the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. Leaving her behind wasn't an option. Not anymore. She wasn't just bait. She was the daughter of his enemy, and now a liability to a shadowy third party. She was tangled in this as much as he was. He made his decision. He rested the rifle he'd taken on the boulder, the stock fitting snugly against his good shoulder. He lined up the sights, not on the sniper, but on a loose rock outcropping just above the man's head. He wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to send a message. I know you're there, and I'm not your asset. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the report echoing across the canyon like a crack of thunder. Down below, every head snapped up. Kane, Alara, all the riders, they all looked toward the sound of the shot. On the far ridge, the sniper was just as surprised. The bullet slammed into the rock above him, sending a shower of stone chips raining down. The man ducked instinctively, his own shot ruined. He glanced across the canyon, his eyes meeting Silas's. For a moment, two hunters stared at each other across a battlefield of their own making. Then the sniper was gone, melting back into the rocks like a ghost. But Silas had seen his face. Just for a second. And it was a face he recognized. A face from his past. A U.S. Marshal named Jedediah Thorne. A man who was supposed to be dead. The twist was so sharp it left Silas breathless. This wasn't a company man. This was a lawman. A federal marshal. What in God's name was a dead marshal doing working for a shadow organization and trying to protect a wanted man like Silas Kane? Down below, the confusion had turned to panic. Kane and his men had no idea where the second shot came from, or who it was for. They were caught between Silas on one ridge, a ghost sniper on the other, and an escaping hostage. Their perfect trap had crumbled into a chaotic three-way standoff. This was his chance. He slid back from the boulder, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and ran. He moved along the ridgeline, using the rocks for cover, heading toward the position where Alara was pinned down. He had to get to her. She was the only one who might have answers. He scrambled down a steep, narrow ravine, rocks sliding under his boots. He landed hard at the bottom, just behind the cluster of rocks where she was hiding. He could hear Kane shouting on the other side. "Spread out! Find him! I want Kane's head!" Silas crept forward, rifle ready. He peered through a crack in the rocks. He could see two of Kane's men advancing on Alara's position. He moved to the edge of the rock and whistled softly. Alara's head jerked up. Her eyes, wide with fear, found his. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed back, indicating the ravine he'd just come down. She understood. He waited for the two men to get closer. They were moving carelessly now, thinking their target was cornered and alone. Silas stepped out from behind the rock. "Looking for me?" The two men spun around, surprise etched on their faces. They were fast, raising their rifles, but Silas was faster. He fired twice. The shots were less than a second apart. Both men crumpled to the ground before they could even get a shot off. The old instincts were back. The cold, precise calm of a gunfight. He hated it, but right now, it was keeping him alive. He turned to Alara. Let's go. Now. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled out of her hiding place and followed him into the ravine. They climbed, Silas pushing her up ahead of him, his body screaming with every movement. The shouting behind them grew more frantic. They reached the top of the ravine, emerging back on the ridge, but further down the canyon. The sun had almost set, and the desert was bathed in a deep purple twilight. "Where are we going?" she panted, her chest heaving. "Away from here," Silas said, scanning their back trail. He couldn't see anyone following. Not yet. "Who is Jedediah Thorne?" Alara stopped dead, her face going pale. "How do you know that name?" "He was the sniper on the ridge," Silas said, watching her reaction closely. "The one who shot at Cain. He's supposed to be dead, so I'll ask again. Who is he?" Alara wrung her hands, her eyes darting around nervously. "He works for a different kind of business, not my father's. He told my father he could deliver you. He said he represented powerful interests from back east. The railroad." The railroad. Of course. It was always about the railroad, or the mines, or the water. Someone with deep pockets wanted something in this territory, and Silas was somehow standing in their way. Or worse, they wanted to use him to clear the way. "My ranch," Silas said, the pieces falling into place. "My land. What's on it?" "Water," she whispered. "The only clean spring for 50 miles. The railroad needs it for the new line they're pushing through. My father has been trying to buy you out for years. You always refused. So he made a deal with Thorne. Thorne gets you off the land, and my father gets the deed. But Thorne, he has his own plans." Silas stared out at the darkening landscape. He wasn't just a man with a past. He was a pawn in a much larger game, a war for the future of the territory. Redding wanted him dead for revenge and for his water. Thorne and the railroad wanted him alive, as some kind of asset. And he was caught in the middle, with a wounded shoulder and the daughter of his enemy by his side. "We need to move," Silas said, his voice hard. "They'll be coming." They started to run, stumbling through the twilight. The desert that had been his refuge was now a hunting ground, and he was the prize. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. They ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the rocky, unforgiving landscape. Finally, Silas spotted what he was looking for. A dark slit in the side of a mesa, almost invisible in the gloom. An old, abandoned mine shaft he'd discovered years ago. "In here," he gasped, pushing Alara toward the opening. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of earth and stone. It was pitch black. Silas fumbled in his pockets, his fingers finding a small tin of matches. He struck one, the tiny flames sputtering to life, casting flickering shadows on the damp rock walls. The mine was small, just a single tunnel stretching back about 50 feet before ending in a rock fall. But it was dry, and more importantly, it was defensible. He slumped against the wall, the adrenaline finally starting to fade, leaving behind a deep, throbbing pain in his shoulder. Alara huddled on the far side of the tunnel, wrapping her arms around herself, looking small and lost. The match went out, plunging them back into darkness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deeper in the mine. "Why did you help me?" Alara finally asked, her voice small in the dark. "Back there, you could have left me." "'Cause that's not who I am," Silas said quietly. "Or at least, that's not who I'm trying to be." "You're Silas Kane," she said, as if the name explained everything. "My father used to tell stories about you. He said you were the devil himself with a pistol." "Your father tells stories to scare children," Silas replied, his voice rough. "The man he's talking about is dead." "He didn't look dead back there," she countered. "The way you moved. The way you shot those men." Silas didn't answer. She was right. The monster he'd tried to bury was clawing its way back to the surface, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. He felt the coldness seeping back into him, the deadly calm that had guided him through so many fights. It had saved his life today. But what would it cost him tomorrow? He struck another match, needing to see her face. In the brief, flickering light, he saw that she was crying silently, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this. I thought they would just take you. I made a deal with Cain. He would get you for my father, and I would be free." My father. He's a monster. I just wanted to get away. "A deal with a snake is still a deal with a snake," Silas said, though his voice lacked any real heat. He was too tired to be angry. "You learn that lesson quick out here, or you don't learn it at all." The match died. Darkness fell again. He could hear her shifting, moving closer. He felt her hand touch his good arm. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's bad, isn't it?" "I've had worse," he lied. "Let me see," she insisted. He felt her tear a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress. He gritted his teeth as she carefully, gently started to clean the wound in the dark. Her touch was surprisingly steady. "Thorn," Silas said, breaking the silence. "You said he works for the railroad, but he was a marshal. A good one, from what I heard. What happened to him?" "He was investigating the railroad," she said, her voice low. "Accidents on the line. Workers disappearing. He got too close to the truth. They couldn't buy him, so they tried to kill him. Everyone thinks they succeeded." "But they didn't," Silas finished. "They recruited him instead, or blackmailed him." "I don't know," she said. "He doesn't talk about it. He just works for them now. He's their fixer. When they need a problem to go away, they send Thorn." "And I'm a problem," Silas murmured. "No," Alara said, her hands stopping their work. "He told my father you're not a problem. You're the solution." The words hung in the dark, heavy and cold. A solution to what? Why would a dead marshal, working for a corrupt railroad, want to recruit a retired gunslinger? Before Silas could process the new, terrifying question, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A faint scraping sound. From outside the mine entrance. Someone had found them. Silas's hand shot out in the dark, grabbing the rifle. He moved to the mouth of the mine, pressing his back against the cold stone, every sense on high alert. Alara stifled a gasp behind him. The scraping came again, closer this time. It wasn't the sound of a man trying to be stealthy. It was the sound of something being dragged. He held his breath, listening. The desert night was silent. No wind, no crickets. Just that one, chilling sound. A shadow fell across the mine entrance. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the starry sky. It was too tall to be Cain, too broad to be Thorn. The figure took a step into the mine, and the faint starlight caught the glint of something in its hand. Not a rifle. An axe. And it was stained dark with blood. The figure took another step, and Silas could finally make out its face. It was one of Cain's riders, or what was left of him. His eyes were wide with a vacant, mindless terror. His jaw hung slack, and from a deep, gruesome wound in his chest, something was moving. Silas raised the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't one of Redding's men. This was something else. Something horribly, terribly wrong. "Get back!" Silas hissed to Alara. The man, the thing, kept coming, dragging one leg behind him as if it were broken. It made a low, guttural noise, a sound that wasn't human. Silas fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the man square in the chest, throwing him back against the tunnel wall. He slid to the floor in a heap and lay still. Silas kept the rifle trained on the body, his breath held tight in his chest. A deep, profound silence settled over the mine. Is he dead? Alara whispered from the darkness behind him. He should be, Silas said, his voice strained. But then, the body began to move. It started with a twitch of a finger, then a leg. The man, the thing, pushed himself up, the movement jerky and unnatural. The hole in his chest, right where his heart should be, was a gaping black wound. But he was getting up. Silas stared in disbelief. He'd shot men before. He knew what a fatal wound looked like. And this was a fatal wound. The thing was on its feet now, swaying slightly. It turned its vacant eyes toward them and started to shuffle forward again, the bloody axe raised. A cold, primal fear, deeper than anything he'd felt in the canyon, gripped Silas. This wasn't a man anymore. He didn't know what it was, but he knew a bullet to the chest wasn't going to stop it. He aimed higher. He fired again. The bullet took the thing in the head. The impact snapped its head back, and it collapsed to the ground, this time for good. Silence. Silas stood there, shaking, the smell of cordite thick in the air. He fumbled for another match, his hands trembling too much to strike it on the first try. On the third, it flared to life. He held it out, illuminating the body. It was one of Kane's men, all right. But his skin was pale, almost gray. And around the wound in his chest, the flesh was blackened, crisscrossed with strange, dark veins. It looked like some kind of poison or disease. But it was the man's eyes that would haunt him. They were open, staring, but completely empty. There was nothing behind them. No thought. No soul. What was that? Alara breathed, her voice shaking. I don't know, Silas said, the match burning his fingertips as it died out. He was a man who'd seen the worst of what people could do to each other. But this was different. This was unnatural. And then he remembered. The legends. The old stories the native tribes told about the area. Stories of a sickness that came from the earth. A sickness that stole a man's mind and turned him into a walking, hungry corpse. They called it the blight. He'd always dismissed them as ghost stories, campfire tales to scare newcomers. He wasn't dismissing them anymore. A new, horrifying possibility began to form in his mind. The railroad. The accidents. The disappearing workers. Thorne's investigation. What if the railroad hadn't just found water on his land? What if they'd dug too deep and unearthed something else? Something ancient and evil? What if they'd unleashed the blight? And what if Silas Kane, the retired gunslinger, wasn't the solution to a land dispute, but to a plague that could wipe out the entire territory? The thought was so monstrous, so insane, that he almost laughed. But the body on the floor of the mine, with a hole in its head, wasn't laughing. He realized with dawning horror that this was no longer about revenge or land, or even the railroad. This was about survival, not just his survival, everyone's. He grabbed Alara's arm. We have to go, right now. Go where? She cried. Kane's men are out there, and those things. There's a town, Silas said, his mind racing. Dust Devil. It's a day's ride east. It's small, isolated, but there's a doctor there, and a sheriff. We need help. We need to warn them. They stumbled out of the mine and back into the night. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt like it was watching them, teeming with a new kind of predator. A predator that didn't stop, didn't feel, and couldn't be killed by conventional means. They found a small stream, and Silas drank deeply, then refilled his canteen. His shoulder was a constant burning agony, but the fear was a bigger fire, consuming everything else. They walked for hours under the cold light of the stars. Every shadow seemed to hold a shuffling figure. Every sound was a potential threat. Just before dawn, as the eastern sky began to glow a soft gray, they saw it. Smoke. A pillar of black smoke rising into the air, not 5 miles from their position. What is it? Alara asked. A fire, Silas said, his gut twisting. A big one. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, what was burning. It was his ranch, his home, the life he had built for himself over 10 years. Kane, or Redding, or maybe even Thorne, had decided to erase him completely. They had taken his past, and now they had taken his future. All he had left was the fight in front of him. He looked at the rising smoke, and something inside him hardened. The rancher was gone, burned away with his home. The man who was left was colder, sharper. It was the man he had tried to kill a decade ago. It was Silas Kane. And Silas Kane had work to do. He wasn't just going to warn the town. He was going to stop this, no matter who he had to go through. Redding, Kane, Thorne, the railroad, even the dead themselves. He turned to Alara, his face set like stone in the gray dawn light. Let's go finish this. If you were on the edge of your seat listening to this story, and you want to see how Silas brings justice to the desert, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the story of the Blight is far from over.